Hey everybody, platforming in the name of here. That's right, I'm an engineer now. I mean, why would I keep wasting my time digging around in the dirt when I could build a staircase? Or a canopy for when it rains. Alright, I'm obviously being facetious here because I'm a driller for life, but I play engineer too. And in this series, I'll be sharing one of my favorite builds for one of the other three classes of Deep Rock Galactic. To kick the series off, I want to talk about one of my favorite builds in all of Deep Rock, which is my Spinning Death build for the Engineer. But before we get started, at the end of the video, Kyle and I will be announcing the details of our giveaway, so be sure to stick around until then for a chance to win your very own flare from D3lta Props. Back to my Spinning Death build, as you can probably guess, the breach cutter is the centerpiece of this loadout. But because it's the thing that ties everything together, we're going to go over the rest of the build first. For starters, we're going to take the Warthog as our primary with a pretty straightforward build focusing mainly on rate of fire. Jumping into the equipment terminal, I'm going to take Tier 1A, Tier 2A, Tier 3B, Tier 4B, and Tier 5A with Cycle Overload as my overclock. Built out this way, you can kill a basic grunt with one shot to the mouth, a slasher in 2, and guards between 4 and 6 shots. To be honest, I'm not usually a shotgun guy in video games because the slow rate of fire and constant reloading kinda drives me nuts. Having said that, you might be wondering why I don't take minor adjustments in Tier 5 for fully automatic fire, but Turret Whip is really important for this build. More on that later. Speaking of turrets, let's talk about our sentry gun. And I do mean gun, singular. As someone who doesn't play engineer all the time, I'm constantly having to remind myself throughout a mission to maintain my sentry gun. And although I'm aware that overall 2 sentry guns can inflict way more damage, I personally find myself more effective when I only have one to deal with. So back in the equipment terminal, I'm obviously going to take Tier 1B, followed by Tier 2B, Tier 3A, and Tier 4A. Quick side note here, as we get further into the video, you'll notice the one glaring downside of this build is a lack of range. If you run your engineer this way, you're going to be doing most of your fighting up close. But one upside to taking only one turret is it gets a 25% boost in its range, and that turret whip mod I mentioned earlier gives it a nice long-range damage boost. Shooting your turret with your Warthog causes it to fire a powerful shot at the cost of 5 sentry ammo. But what you may not know is aside from doing 160 explosive damage, it also triggers a 1.5 second stun, breaks armor, and fears enemies. Fear is really nice because it not only backs enemies off you, it can also cancel your target's current action. Turret Whip also applies to all turrets, so if you have multiple engineers on your team, you can use their turrets as well. Plus, if you shoot their turrets, you spend their ammo. The Tier 2B mod is key for me as well because it cuts the construction time in half, and that can be really crucial in situations where you're being chased or you just get caught off guard by a mob. I did experiment with the Hawkeye system in Tier 4 because I thought it would be nice to be able to manually select specific targets that are outside my range, but I really felt the loss of the damage boost from Defender system and felt like my turrets burned through a lot more ammo while killing less enemies. On to our grenade, and for this build, I'm going to go with the SSGs. I was a Proxmine guy for a long time, but the SSGs are just too good. Tossing one of these in the middle of a swarm gives you a really nice added layer of autonomous protection to go along with your sentry gun. In addition to doing some really nice damage, they also break armor and reduce enemy movement speed by 30% for 1 second on each hit. On top of all that, you get 4 of them, they last either 40 seconds or 12 attacks, and they do 0 friendly fire damage, making the SSGs both literally and figuratively a no-brainer. And going back to our range issue, these deploy on impact rather than after a set period of time, so you can chuck these across the cave at an enemy that's out of your range to soften it up while you close distance. If you want to know all the raw numbers on exactly how good these things are, Lazy Maybe has a great breakdown that I'll link to below. Pretty simple for the platform gun. We'll take Tier 1B, Tier 2 duh, and Tier 3B. And finally, the main course. I think it's pretty safe to say that the Engineer has by far the most powerful secondary weapons in the game, and the Breach Cutter is easily my favorite. Now, I know the Shard Diffractor can be insanely powerful, and the PGL with Fat Boy is annoyingly popular, but the Breach Cutter really feels like the most unique and versatile of the three. There are a bunch of wildly different ways to use the Breach Cutter, but if you haven't picked up on it by now, we're building ours around the Spinning Death overclock. So jumping back into the equipment terminal, we're going to take Tier 1A, Tier 2A, Tier 3A, Tier 4B, and Tier 5B, followed of course by the Spinning Death overclock. Before we leave the equipment terminal, the 2 perks you should take for this build are Dash and Born Ready, which I'll get into later. Spinning Death conceptually is pretty simple. Instead of your beam traveling forward until it dies, it stops and spins in place. Now, if you're following along in the equipment terminal and watching your DPS and max ammo get crushed for something that spins in a circle, I understand your skepticism. But stick with me, because this is genuinely one of the most versatile overclocks in the game. For starters, this gives you 5 times the base beam duration, meaning your spinning beam lasts a whopping 7.5 seconds. Second, Tier 4B gives you a 100% chance to inflict a 3-second stun, trapping enemies within that beam. Third, losing a third of your max ammo may seem rough, but this was actually a 50% penalty before Season 4. The plasma trail in Tier 5 gives us an extra 5 fire damage every 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. Alright, enough of these annoying alliterative numbers. Let's take a look at all the different ways you can use Spinning Death. Now obviously you can just fire this thing into a crowd of bugs. Spinning Death will tear through weaker enemies like grunts, guards, and slashers, and stronger enemies will get trapped by that stun and continue to take huge damage, to the point that it can actually one-shot a Praetorian. Not so scary now. The nice thing about being in a fixed spot for such a long duration is that if you see enemies filing down a single column, you can pretty much take them all out with one shot. In a way, I kinda use these the way I used to plant prox mines. Speaking of grenades, lures are definitely a solid alternative to SSGs, because you can just force a bunch of bugs into one spot and hit them with Spinning Death. And speaking of one spot, this obviously comes in handy when you're defending a position. A well-placed beam can help keep enemies out of your triangulation zone or away from D3lta. Spinning Death also has some very enemy-specific uses, starting with those pesky swarmers. If you play Engineer often, you probably know that based on your build, swarmers can be kind of a pain in the ass. But with Spinning Death, if you get caught by a swarmer wall and don't have your turret up yet, just fire a beam parallel to the ground and stand in the middle. Your beam won't damage you, and all the swarmers will die before they can reach you. And the nice thing about having Plasma Trail is that it lasts 4 seconds past the death of the beam and will continue to kill swarmers. You can also use the terrain to do a similar thing with medium-sized enemies. If done correctly, Spinning Death can also negate the Swarmer explosion when you kill a Brood Nexus. It's hard to say the exact height, but you can see here that my beam is between 5 and 10 platforms high. But if you get it at just the right height, all of the Swarmers appear right in the middle of the beam and instantly die. It's also great against Mactera Goo Bombers, which become completely stun-locked. And if you're able to rip one off in time, your beam can actually save you when picked up by a grabber. The width of the beam also makes it a great option when attacking single targets that have multiple areas to attack. For example, it can hit all 3 protrusions on a Hive Guard, both Xynarch Charge Suckers on a Betsy, or all 3 cooling tanks on an Omen Tower. It's also a nice line of defense against the flying rock section of escort duty, and it's super effective at dealing with swarms of Rockpox enemies. Quick side note, in doing some testing for me for this video, MeatShield discovered that the beam is actually twice as long as the listed width in the equipment terminal, making our beam 6 meters wide and not 3.
Ta-da! Science.
Now let's talk about some more general strategies. I mentioned earlier that standing in the middle of the beam won't damage you, but aside from protecting you from oncoming enemies, you can also take advantage of the stun to get to an objective. This really comes in handy when you need to repair a pipe section in a refining mission, or when you need to revive someone who is covered in enemies. And since, again, it doesn't damage you, you can pass back and forth through the beam to continuously draw enemies into it. The beam also does very minimal friendly fire damage, so you can even shoot one at a teammate to protect them from enemies. One of the coolest things about the Breach Cutter is that it passes through terrain, and although that can really come in handy when targets are far away, you can still take advantage of this to attack enemies from behind cover. Alright, now that we've seen a bunch of specific ways to use Spinning Death, let's put it all together with the rest of our build. Let me show you an example of what I do when a big swarm hits. For starters, I usually throw an SSG on the ground so it can start doing some damage immediately. I use Dash, as I mentioned earlier, to get far enough away that I can use that Tier 2B mod to get my sentry up quickly. As soon as it starts firing, I know it's selected a target, so I can hit it with my Warthog to fire a turret whip shot to do some damage behind me and stun anything that's getting close. By the time I turn around, I have my Breach Cutter out and ready to fire at the biggest group of enemies. While Spinning Death does its work, I use the Warthog to clean up the enemies not caught within the beam. And because I took Born Ready, my Breach Cutter is automatically reloaded after 5 seconds with the perk maxed out, so it's ready for me to fire again if needed. With the Warthog, Breach Cutter, Sentry Gun, and SSGs all having the ability to stun, we have tons of ways to keep a safe distance during a swarm. Dash is super important for this as well, and Born Ready allows us to stay on offense with the Warthog without having to worry about the long reload time of the Breach Cutter. Quick side note, I mentioned sentry gun maintenance earlier, and although I'm sure most engineers know this, I do think it's worth mentioning. If your turret is already built somewhere, you can either hold your reload button to recall it to yourself and then place it, or you can select the turret utility tool and place the hologram, which then recalls your turret to that spot. The difference between the two is recalling your turret to a spot places it with whatever ammo it had when it was recalled, but recalling your turret to yourself and waiting for it to get to you before placing it fully reloads your sentry gun. So it's really important to remember to recall your turret when you leave an area, both because it reloads your sentry gun and because it obviously takes less time the less distance it has to travel. And speaking of distance, although this build is fairly limited in that regard, you won't be completely incapable of hitting faraway targets. For one thing, the Warthog can actually hit things like acid spitters, web spitters, and cave leeches from pretty far away, and do enough damage to kill them. The menaces can be a menace, but I usually wait for them to spawn close enough to hit them with Spinning Death, which obviously stuns them long enough to finish them off. And of course, we still have our sentry gun with Turret Whip, which can target enemies up to 25 meters away. All in all, I'm over here now. All in all, this is a really fun, powerful, and ultimately satisfying build that really forces you to stay mobile and use all the tools at your disposal. And Spinning Death may be a bit of an underrated overclock because I don't really see it much down in the caves, so I hope you give it a try if you haven't already. Let me know what you think, and if you have any of your own creative uses for Spinning Death, please share your strategies in the comments below. But before we go, I do have a message from a friend?
Hello! Hello again, everyone. For those who haven't seen me previously, my name is Kyle and I'm the owner of D3lta Studios. I create 3D printed replica props and prop kits from DRG as well as many other science fiction universes, and I'm honored to be partnered with the D3lta channel to share my creations with all of you. In the last abyss of our video, I mentioned that I'd be doing a flare giveaway through the channel, and I wanted to take the time now to go more in depth regarding the specifics. You've all been extremely supportive of me as a sponsor of the channel, and so I wanted to give back to the community through the things that I make. Through this giveaway, you'll receive one of my DRG flare props, which includes LEDs to make the prop glow in whichever color you'd like. To enter for a chance to win, simply comment down below what you believe is the most underrated weapon or overclock from the game. There will be a draw at a later date where we will announce the lucky winner. In the meantime, I have plenty of other awesome props and prop kits available on my Etsy store at D3ltaprops.etsy.com. Use the code D3lta10 at checkout for 10% off your order.
This is a really generous offer from Kyle, and I'm feeling inspired, so I'm actually going to match his giveaway. Like he said, to enter, just leave a comment below with what you believe to be the most underrated weapon or overclock in the game, and in a couple weeks, we'll randomly select 2 winners who will receive their very own flare from D3lta Props. And in the meantime, if anything in this shop strikes your fancy, be sure to use code D3lta10 at checkout for 10% off your order. Big thank you to Kyle for creating this giveaway, big thank you to you for watching, and as always, rock and stone.